Good morning, everybody, and welcome to another edition of Elevenses. You're watching Kevin Williams here of Survival Skills Rider Training, keeping you company through the coronavirus pandemic. I realise a lot of you are probably back out to work by now, but for the time being, I'll be keeping the show going for those who are still locked down away from work for one reason or another, or even just working from home and taking a break with a cup of tea. What have we got for you on the show this morning? We're going to have a look at the couple of crashes which have happened involving motorcycles. I keep banging on about this, but it is important. The effect of the coronavirus crisis on Triumph motorcycles. We will be looking at the effects of spraying a flammable liquid over a hot motorcycle. That one was fairly spectacular. We'll have a look at tilting Kawasaki patent that's gone on the show as well. And I'll be talking about power, torque and thrust, and trying to explain the difference between the three so that we can understand what's actually going on with our motorcycles we ride. So, okay, on with the show. Well, for starters, it looks like our Mediterranean spring has finally come to an end. It's been not just the sunniest May, it's been the sunniest month ever on record right across the UK, apparently. It's also been incredibly dry, as you probably noticed. So even with the lockdown, people have been riding motorcycles, and of course, as the lockdown has relaxed, so people have been out on bikes, and so have a lot of other people in cars as well. There's been the roads have been very, very busy, and the bad news is that right across the UK, bikers have kept crashing. Now, as I say, I don't want to bore you with this, but it is important that we do try to be aware that risks didn't go away simply because the roads got quiet. And now, of course, they're pretty much back to normal. On Saturday, a story that caught my eye, two riders managed to collide whilst riding in what the police described as a convoy. Now, this happened down near Ivy Bridge in Devon on the A3121 at Ermington. I don't know if you know the area, but this crash, which happened midday on Saturday the 30th, The police attended and they reported shortly afterwards there's no indication yet as to how serious the injuries are, but the road's congested with ambulances also in attendance. Now, I happen to know that area fairly well because I have friends who live not very far away in just outside Totnes, about 15 miles, in fact, from where the crash site is. So it's an area that I ride fairly regularly myself, and it is a beautiful part of the world. Lovely, lovely roads on the edge of Dartmoor. But it's tricky to ride them well. They twist and turn, they're up and down, they're very unpredictable, and they also are often narrow, and they can narrow significantly below what you're expecting. I talked about group riding some weeks ago on Elevenses when people were first starting to get back out on their bikes. One of the issues I warned about at the time was not to follow the rider ahead of you too close. It's a surprisingly common group riding crash. The rider ahead does something a bit unexpected, and the rider behind her has no time and no space either to take some evasive action. So I'll just say again, a lot of people will be rusty after this long layoff. Some people probably won't have ridden very much since last autumn. And all of a sudden they're out in groups, everybody's tempted to wind the power on a bit, just take it a little bit steady. If you're not up to speed, don't try. Don't follow the bloke in front. But if you're behind and you think you're a little bit tasty, then just hang back a little bit, give the rider ahead a bit of space to make an error and for you to be able to deal with it. And if you have to wait for a safe opportunity to pass a slow rider, then wait for it. Don't be in a rush. But honestly, the road that the crash happened on isn't the easiest road to overtake on. I know, as I say, I know it fairly well. And if that just means staying in line and traveling at the same kind of speed as the guy in front of you for a bit, then just do it. Just bite the bullet on that one and enjoy the view. After all, isn't that why you're out riding a bike? To enjoy what you're doing? Anyway, move on. The following day, the Sunday, motorcycle and passenger were seriously injured. They collided with a police car. Now, that crash happened on Sunday evening in the Greater Manchester area. And the rider, who was a man in his 30s, and the passenger, a woman in her 20s, were both taken to hospital, where they're said to be in a stable condition. No one else was injured, but the incident is being referred to the Independent Office of Police Conduct. And so the police are asking for witness statements from anybody who saw what happened. So if you did spot that one, they're looking for help. Okay, so what else have we got? Well, I'll be talking about Triumph in just a moment, but further on in the show, we'll show you what happens when you spray flammable liquid over a motorcycle, and we'll be talking about a tilting Kawasaki, which has been patented, and I'll have a look at power and torque and thrust, because they are all slightly different and they all give you a different understanding of how your bike is performing. Okay, so don't forget, if you have a comment or a question about anything I'm talking about, drop me a line. I will answer it at the end of the show when I go off the live broadcast. If you've got any feedback, I'm always interested to hear it. Let me know if you're enjoying the shows and if you think I ought to carry on with them, and any suggestions for future items. I'm always happy to hear those too. Okay, so Triumph, what's been going on with Triumph? Well, the first effects of the recession caused by the coronavirus crisis have been felt by the UK motorcycle industry. Triumph Motorcycles have announced 240 UK job losses. The business actually employs around 2,500 people around the world, with just over 1,000 actually in the UK. Globally, they are laying off 400 people. And staff were told, sadly, about these job losses earlier this week. The management at Hinckley basically say that sales of big bikes have taken a hit from the global lockdown, and specifically that they had seen significantly reduced global demand for large capacity motorcycles. And they posted a pretty stark message that saying that it might be hard to bounce back from this predicted global recession post-virus. The Chief Commercial Officer, Paul Stroud, said sales of Triumph bikes had never fully recovered from the credit crunch of a decade ago. And he said that what people were doing were holding off on what he called discretionary purchases. Those are the ones that we don't have to make but like to make. And he said he expects a similar trend this time around. Even though, even before the pandemic, Triumph were planning on making big changes to production. And in February, they'd warned of 50 job losses at the UK headquarters. And that's because they are planning to make Thailand the main centre of manufacturing. Currently, only 1 in 10 of the 65,000 bikes Triumph builds every year are actually built in the UK. And as I mentioned in other shows recently, Thailand is the big growth centre for power two-wheelers right at this moment. And Triumph announced back in February that their intention is to realign operations, that's their word, to double their share of the Asian market over the next 3 years. And I've also mentioned that they have partnered with the Indian manufacturer Bajaj, who are likely to be building a small capacity Triumph for them at some point. So Hinckley will become the research, design and prototyping centre for new models, but it does seem that production will largely be shifted offshore. A statement from the company said, sales in the larger 500cc plus motorcycle segment in key markets such as France, Italy, Germany, the USA and UK have fallen by between 40 and 65% over the past 3 months during what would normally be the peak season for sales. Although Triumph sales have outperformed this significant decline to some degree, the market is forecast to remain considerably down on pre-COVID-19 levels as a direct result of the economic conditions created by it. And it went on to say that drastic steps would help it lay the foundations for future global growth in the decades to come. Triumph Motorcycles chief exec Nick Bloor said these are not only challenging times for everyone as individuals, but also for the company. No business could have anticipated the scale of the coronavirus crisis and its economic consequences. And basically, he goes on to say that the decisions to change the marketing from the manufacturing from the UK to Thailand and loss of jobs in the UK, he says it's not easy decisions to make, especially when individuals' livelihoods are affected. However, the scale of impacts of COVID-19 necessitates us to restructure now in order to protect the long-term health and success of the Triumph brand and business. So, as I've said in the recent shows, look out for the appearance of a small capacity Triumph. The very top end bikes of any mark, any make, are likely to continue selling. Someone will always have the cash to buy the sort of top of the range motorcycles. The big impact is going to be almost certainly on the ordinary big model, the sort of thing that people aspire to, ordinary people like you and me want to get hold of, but will probably be keeping cash in their pocket right now. So keep an eye open for those small bikes. I think you'll see them sooner rather than later. It's probably not a coincidence, of course, that an advert from Triumph arrived in my email yesterday telling me their dealers are open for business again and that test rides are available. So okay, so you're watching Elevenses Live with Kevin Williams of Survival Skills. Remember that if you can't read, you can ride. I've got that the wrong way around, haven't I? Let's start again. If you can't ride, you can read. You can head over to my Spotlight page on Lulu, where my paperbacks are on sale. They've been updating the website, which means effectively they broke it for a month, but it now does seem to be working again properly. Everything there is where it should be with a new design. So do head over to Lulu and see what you can get over there if you're interested. Right, okay, so let's have a quick look at a picture I wanted to show you. Where is it? There it is. Just have a quick look at that. That's what happens when you spray flammable disinfectant over a hot motorcycle. Flammable liquids have a big drawback. They tend to catch fire, and that poor unfortunate soul discovered that. the idea is that these are drive-through stations where you can have your bike disinfected from COVID-19. Is taking place in India. Well, frankly, spraying something hot over something like that over a hot motorcycle exhaust isn't a great idea in the first place. With the engine running, not even beginning to be clever. I'd really be very interested to know who signed off the health and safety assessment on that particular idea. I'll put the full video link up at the end of the show in the comments so you can go and have a look. Fortunately, it looks like no long-term harm was done to either the bike or the rider, but not a clever one. Okay, so don't forget, you can catch up with Elevenses on Wednesdays, Fridays, and Sundays right now at 11 a.m. every day that I'm broadcasting. What else do I want to show you? Well, have a look at this again. Let me get the right picture up again. There we are. One of the perennial challenges for vehicle designers has always been to try to find some kind of perfect marriage between a car and a motorcycle. That vehicle there dates back to the 1910s, and it's called a Nera car. It was actually designed on an even earlier model, but the idea was that it was some kind of alternative, an affordable alternative to a motor car, but it used a step-through design, as you can see, which enabled you to use it wearing a skirt. And there was also sufficient bodywork on many of these machines, many of these Nera cars, designed to protect the rider from sort of road grime and engine oil as well. So the idea was that it was a kind of substitute car. The front end was interesting. You can see the handlebars aren't directly connected to the front wheel. That's because it was a hub center steered model with a sort of linkage from those bars. So it was apparently very stable to ride as well. And since then, anyway, there have been numerous attempts to build two-wheelers, three-wheelers, where either the front wheel is the steering wheel and there's two wheels at the back. Triumph had a crack at that back in the 60s. There are three-wheelers where there are two wheels at the front and one at the rear. And there are even narrow track four-wheelers that kind of blur the distinction a bit between a car and a bike. The Renault Twizy is a good example there of a single-seater. Well, it's actually two-seater, but they're in tandem, the rider and the passenger in line. So, but what often goes missing when you're talking about these kind of things is the affordability. Now, just have a quick look at this. There it is. That's a patent drawing for a Kawasaki. Now, you'll notice several things. First of all, the passengers and the rider sit next to each other as opposed to in line. You'll also notice that the front wheels are steering car-like, they're vertical, but the body is actually the leaning mechanism. Now, that patent was filed back in November 2018. It appeared in online the other day, which I spotted it. So it's different from the Nikon or the Tricity that I mentioned the other day. Again, I'll just shuffle through the pictures and I'll find the one of the Tricity. There, oops, just shot past it. There it is. That's the Yamaha Tricity. Like the Piaggio MP3 and the Nikon, with this one, the front wheels tilt at the same time as the body tilts. So the whole bike basically leans over. With the Kawasaki, the whole body leans and the bike itself basically counter effects the effect of centrifugal force. And yes, I do know there's no such thing as centrifugal force really, but it is a handy concept. So you get the effect of balancing the rider and passenger against that force, but the front wheels stay vertical. The engine is situated at the rear behind the rider and driver. The engine, well, it could be petrol, it could be electric, and there's some suggestion it could be something I mentioned again the other day, that it could be a hybrid. Is it ever likely to see the light of day? I would suggest it's highly unlikely. Okay, so don't forget, you're watching Elevenses with Kevin Williams here. I'll be back with the next show on Friday. And just as a reminder that I have relaunched my bike training courses as of Monday. I do have my first booking now for next week. So if you are looking for some motorcycle training post-test, give me a bell, drop me a line on the email, contact me via the contact form, and we'll sort something out. New times do demand new solutions, so these won't be the old-fashioned, the back in the day before COVID-19, when I was out on the road on the full course. I will be making extensive use of video links to do some of the theory work that I would otherwise have done face to face. So we will be making some fairly major changes to the way the courses are run, but they are available now. Go and have a look at the website survivalskills.co.uk and you'll find out what I'm doing. Right, okay, now on to the final point that I wanted to bring up. This is sort of follow up something that came up the other day on one of my Elevenses shows, when I was talking about riding smaller motorcycles and how they can be just as much fun as bigger bikes. And what we're looking at here is the distinction between three terms: power, torque, and thrust. And I'll try to explain how they work. Now, I've watched motorcycle racing for many years, and years ago at Brands Hatch, some of the events that they used to hold were so-called open class races, where they mixed up the bikes from different classes. They're always interesting fun, and one of the things I remember was watching Damon Hill, yes, the F1 champion. He was a motorcyclist and a very, very good motorcyclist before he switched to from two to four wheels, riding a TZ250 and absolutely trouncing the much more powerful 1000cc four-cylinder bikes to win an end-of-season championship race. Now, a decent TZ250 put out about 80 horsepower, so it's not far off an ER6 or the MT-07, for example. A little bit up on those, a little bit down on something like the 900 Tracer. But people struggle to ride bikes like that because they're not powerful enough. Well, if you're a TT fan, you may well have noticed that the ER6 has become the basis of a very successful racer, which has replaced the old two-stroke class on the island. So how much power do we actually need? Now, TT is one thing, that's racing, but what about on the road? Well, back in June 2006, quite a long time ago now, but it's still relevant, Ride magazine had a very interesting article, because what they did was they stuck a data logger on a GSXR 600, and then they sent a number of their staff, 4 of their staff, out to ride around their favorite test loop with the data logger on the back to see what was happening. Now, Steve Rose lapped their 40-mile TT circuit with, in his words, the speedo barely dropping below 100 miles per hour. Well, a little bit of hyperbole, because he actually averaged just over 60 miles per hour, but clearly a highly illegal speed to be travelling on the public roads. How much power do you think he actually needed to get around the circuit that quick? Well, here's the answer. He actually needed an average of 26.3 horsepower for the entire ride. 26.3 horsepower. That's all that it took him to average 60 miles per hour. Average 60 miles an hour. He used a peak power of 72 horsepower. Now that's about 30 short of the bike's output. His average throttle opening was 15%, and he never, ever, anywhere on the ride got the throttle more than half open. So 72 horsepower, peak power, well, that's the output of those, that ER and that MT that I just talked about. Emma Franklin managed to lap at a more legal sounding 47.4 miles per hour. Now, that's still not unimpressive, because if you try averaging 45 miles per hour on a cross-country run, it's not as easy as it sounds. When I was a courier, I used to work on an average speed of 40 miles an hour for cross-country riding when I was calculating how long it would take me to deliver a parcel. So she averaged 47.4 miles per hour over this 40-mile loop. how much power do you think she required to manage that? Well, the answer is 11.1 horsepower. 11. Yep. Guess what CG125 makes? 11 horsepower. She used an average of 10% of the throttle and a maximum of 39.4 horsepower. Now, that's rather less than the output of the average restricted 500cc A2 licensed machine. Tim Skelton, he's the editor at the time, lapped at 51. He used an average of 13.5 horsepower with a peak of 94. So he did manage to get the throttle open somewhere. But again, 13.5, that's less than a CBR 125 puts out, less than an R125. And he managed to open the throttle on that bike just 13.5% on average. So what are we actually seeing here? Well, horsepower is really the wrong thing to focus on. Horsepower is used for three things. It's used to accelerate the mass of the motorcycle rider off the line. It's used to push you up a steep hill. And it's also used to push the wind aside and overcome friction. So we might be using full throttle to drive a small bike forward, but think about what happens when you're riding a bigger machine. The problem is that if you twist the bike's throttle anywhere near the stop, it's going to wheelie. And wheeling actually limits how fast you can accelerate. So we have a problem here where peak power on one of these motorcycles actually exceeds what the bike can actually cope with. It will just simply loop over the back, and that's why the bigger machines all have some kind of power limiting system in the low gears just to stop them looping. So the bigger the engine, the further towards the red line, or the further up the speedo, I should say, that peak power lives, because it's usually somewhere up towards the red line on the tacho. And if you have a machine that's capable of 180 odd miles per hour in top gear, then your peak power simply isn't accessible in the lower gears. Think about it. If you are riding a typical 600, they're geared to hit around 70 miles per hour in first gear. Now, that means unless you are riding around in first gear on back streets, back lanes, country roads, you're not actually going to be able to use the full power output of the motorcycle. Think about an R1 or a GSX-R 1000. Now you've got a first gear which takes you to 100 miles per hour. You can't even get close to peak power on the road at anything like legal speeds. And the moment you start moving up through the gearbox to higher gears, you are even further away from peak power. So the reason that what we actually need to look at is something called thrust. Now, you may remember the old RD 250s road bikes, the sort of road-going version of the CZ. You may remember they were wheelie mad. They used to pop wheelies at the drop of a hat. Now, you could quite easily wheelie one of those just by twisting the throttle and waiting for the revs to climb. You didn't have to do anything clever with the clutch. Literally, you just opened the throttle, sat back and waited. And when they hit the right bit of the rev counter, the front wheel would come up easily. But how much power did they put out? Well, the answer is that the original RD air-cooled was about 25 horsepower. The later TZR water-cooled 250 was around about 40. And we're talking a fraction of what a modern 1000cc sports bike puts out. Now, no bike, as I said, can accelerate faster than it wheelies. So what are we looking at here? And the answer is, as I say, it's thrust. And thrust is the torque, that's the twisting power that the engine produces in the first place, converted by the gears to operate at the back wheel. It's thrust that tells us how the bike will respond. So the torque curve will give you an idea of how the power will be developed over the rev range. If you've got a nice flat torque curve, the engine will produce a very level degree of acceleration right across the rev range. If you've got a peaky torque curve, then it will come in all with a bit of a bang where the highest part of the torque curve is on the rev range. But it's the thrust, which is that torque divided by the gears, which matters. And so the result is that you can have a quickly accelerating motorcycle which doesn't produce much power, simply thanks to the thrust curves. And so it's the gearbox which really matters. Now, of course, if you've got a big motorcycle and you're throttling along on a 10% of the throttle, producing your 10 or 11 horsepower, then you can twist the throttle and it'll accelerate. But in fact, it won't accelerate all that well because all that power is sitting a long, long way up the rev band. So in some ways, big motorcycles are counterproductive. They actually require big throttle openings to get anywhere. The thrust curve is, as I say, a far more important thing to look at, but nobody ever shows you the thrust curves for motorcycles, and it's very difficult to actually spot them. But when you look at something like the thrust curves from my XJ6 and compare it with something like a CBR 600 RR, you'll find that the CBR is 30 plus horsepower, probably more than 30 horsepower up on my XJ, but my XJ produces just as much thrust in the lower gears, and that's a combination of the shape of the torque curve, which is flat, and so it produces, as I say, steady thrust rather than peaky, where it comes in with a bang when the revs eventually get to the right bit of the rev range. But it's also low geared. The XJ actually runs out of revs in first gear at under 50 miles an hour, about 45. That's remarkably low geared by the standards for a modern 600. What that means is when you twist the throttle on that bike in first gear, it accelerates just about as quickly as a CBR 600. There won't be much in it. Now, obviously, I have to change gear on the XJ a lot quicker than I do on the CBR 6. But, on the road, does it really matter? One of the features of both of those bikes is they have quite a long rev range. So all you end up doing is you put the bike in the gear which suits the riding that you're doing, and then you ride the torque curve. And that's where something like the XJ is actually easier to ride than the CBR. Now, the funny thing is that I got picked up for riding in the wrong gear on a bike safe course a couple of years ago. I was out in front of the observer, and he stopped me at one point and said he'd been counting my gears, and I was riding in fourth gear on a country lane. And he said, on a 600 like that, you should be in second. We had a little bit of a debate about it, but he wasn't having any, so I put it in second gear. And he said, there, well, didn't that feel better? And, frankly, the bike had a bit more zip than it did in fourth, but not a lot, because the torque curve is so flat. It doesn't make a great deal of difference with a flat torque curve. And the second thing is, I was revving the nuts off the engine. The XJ only revs to 11,000, and to keep it in second at these kind of speeds, the engine was mostly up around 8, 9, 10,000 RPM, right up towards the red line. And quite frankly, it's run out of the torque curve by the time you get to there. It actually produces a little bit, pretty much the same thrust in fourth gear, where the revs are lower, down to about 5,000 RPM at those kind of speeds, and you actually have enough response there to accelerate and to decelerate. So keeping the revs in the middle part of the rev range is also very useful. So what I'm trying to get over here is that we get hung up very much on peak power when we're thinking about motorcycles. We get hung up on big capacity motors because, in theory, they give you lots and lots of power. But the trouble is, trying to get a bike to full throttle in top gear demands a drag strip, or not even a drag strip. You probably need a 2 or 3 mile long aircraft runway to actually reach the top speed of that motorcycle. It simply doesn't work. You cannot get to it. It's a lazy engine because you can twist the throttle anywhere and it will go. But frankly, for most of us, as those figures I quoted you right at the beginning, a middlingly sized motorcycle will give us all the power we want, and it will give us a much better response while we're riding it. It's not the peak power that we should be looking at really, but it's the 40 to 80 mile per hour acceleration times which really are important, and that will change depending on what gear you're in. So you also need to understand how the thrust curves work. Right. Okay. So it's a fairly complex technique, but go and see what you can find out about thrust curves. They really are the more important part of a road test, but you very rarely ever see them, as I said. So, okay, that's it for today. Don't forget we'll be back on Friday. Don't forget that Survival Skills has kicked off our training again. And if you're interested, you can come over to my coffee page and you can pick up some extra content over there. There are well over 100 now of my old Facebook articles have gone up already. And I'm also putting up the Performance Bends e-course online as we talk. That's going up slowly but steadily. So do come over to coffee and hopefully we'll see you on Friday. Trust you've enjoyed the show. Do drop me a line and we'll hopefully see you again soon. Bye for now.